Welcome to Reward Nerds, the podcast that deep dives into the areas of compensation and benefits. My name is Jon, and I'm your host, and I'm your fellow Reward Nerd. You could always consider who would you ideally talk to when it comes to the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Who is like the ultimate source of information? We asked ourselves that question when we saw all the details coming out around the directive. The answer was very clear from the offset. We really want to talk to the people who were negotiating the directive, who are the ones kind of looking into all the details. And for some reason, we were able to get hold of one of the two chief negotiators in the European Parliament, Kira Marie Peter-Hansen. And we were able to talk to her. We had her over about a year ago for a big roundtable in Copenhagen to talk about the background of the directive and some of the technical details. Now, here in 2025 that we're now, we know a little bit more about what it might look like in a few countries, but many things are still up in the air. And it's just as relevant still to hear directly from the chief negotiator in the European Parliament as to what is the background and purpose about the EU Pay Transparency Directive. There are a few bits and pieces here that I think is still going to maybe surprise or at the very least inspire some of you. So enjoy this interview with Kira. Welcome, Kira. Very happy to have you here. Member of the European Parliament, but also the chief negotiator of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. It is an amazing opportunity to be able to talk to you directly, so welcome.
Great to be here.
Kira, in your opinion, what's the most significant part of the EU Pay Transparency Directive?
Well, I would say that the most significant part is that we at least try to clarify the concept of equal pay for work of equal value and what do we mean with equal value. And then we also mainstream reporting requirements across the EU countries, and we clarify the individual rights that you have as a worker. So those three pillars, I would say, are the most significant.
What are you most proud of with the directive and the way it has turned out?
I think I'm most proud that we managed to get such a strong definition of equal value. That was very difficult. And as well, also, there's taking a lot of steps into making the directive more inclusive in acknowledging, for example, non-binary people, but also intersectional discrimination.
We received quite a few questions from clients also around the scope of the directive, and it looks like it's about gender only. Several clients are talking about ethnicity and sexuality, etc. as criteria. Could you elaborate a bit on why it landed where it landed and that gender is the focus of the directive?
Well, the legal basis that we have in the EU, we can legislate within gender and the working space. So in many countries, for example in France, it's illegal to gather information and data on ethnicity or religion or sexuality. So there's neither a legal basis nor a political wish to collect data on other elements. But I very much agree. We see it both on age and ethnicity and sexuality that we have an issue with equal pay.
There's also this part on intersectional discrimination. Could you elaborate on that piece and what that means?
Yes, and it's the first time that we mention intersectional discrimination in EU legislation. It basically looks at different ways of being discriminated. So based on your color, your gender, whether you're living with a handicap, for example. And what this directive says is that member states and equality bodies should raise awareness around intersectional discrimination, but also if you have court cases and there are multiple factors of discrimination affecting your pay. For example, if you're a woman living with a disability, then that would contribute as an aggravating factor in compensation cases. So that is also something companies should be aware of.
A key pillar in the directive is talking about work of equal value. It's also one our clients struggle a bit with. How would you define the work of equal value seen from your perspective?
Well, I would define it as trying to make some clear criteria that you measure different roles on. So I would say that the purpose is that we don't look at the person we are hiring, but the position that we are looking for. So looking at the role rather than the person, that is the goal of looking at equal pay for equal value. And then more legally, it stems from the International Labour Organization and their definition, and then EU court case law that we have.
So Kira, skills. This is part of the directive and something that's been talked about a lot. Some clients have started working with skills, but soft skills is also part of this. And we see a bit of a dilemma about being able to objectively document and at the same time talking about soft skills. So could you please elaborate a bit on that from your perspective?
Much of it we will see in the implementation, but the aim is to say that currently today we see that companies value, for example, physical strength if you have a physical difficult job when lifting a lot of cement, for example. Where you then don't look at the soft skills as like interpersonal skills, communication, cooperation. So it's a way to make sure that the companies are aware that they take into account also the skills that we sometimes don't see as skills because they're more interpersonal and interlinked.
So a little bit further on soft skills and skills overall, is this going in the direction of need of a point factor-based system?
Yeah, that is one possibility that you have different criteria, different weights on those criteria, and then giving it different points, and then you end with a sum, and that then defines the role and where they should be in the pay range. But you can also do it more simple, and I think especially for the smaller companies that will be necessary because you can't set up a whole database on a point-based system.
Now, the first interaction between a company and a potential employee would be the job ad and thereby the job interview. And in this process, we already know that it's no longer allowed to ask about the salary history. There's been a little bit of controversy as to whether you can ask about the pay expectations. Can you still do that?
I would say so, yes. What we've tried to do is to say we have an issue with women falling behind, and then a female going to a job interview is asked what is her current pay, and then you set the baseline from that. So what we want with this directive is to stop that practice. And by doing that, saying that you can't ask about previous pay. But of course, you have to give the initial pay range in the vacancy note or in a job interview, but then you can still ask, what do you expect? Do you expect to be in the lower or the higher quartile of this band?
So we understand that the companies can ask about pay expectations, but just to make sure everyone understands this the right way, in terms of timing here, is it correct that the company first need to show the pay range?
Yes, I would say that is how it should be understood. It's a bit when we have the EU legislation saying that you can't ask whether people are planning a maternity leave or having children. You can't ask directly, do you plan on having children? But of course you can ask, and people still do it. What are your plans for the future? How do you see this long term? So I think companies should read the spirit of the law and be aware of how these questions can be understood.
So we have a dilemma that we again see when we look into the text, and this is around burden of proof. So when an employer is asked to prove that somebody is being paid as they should, there is no time limitation in the way the text is written, at least interpreted. At the same time, there are GDPR rules, and you can only store data for 5 years. So how do you see the mix between the burden of proof and GDPR rules?
Well, I would say regarding GDPR, I would advise companies, but I would advise them first to speak with the legal department, but to follow the GDPR rules. What we see in Europe, whether it comes to tax transparency or pay transparency, is that GDPR is kind of the overall framework. So I would be very cautious with breaching the GDPR legislation, even if you see it as a way to fulfill another directive. So of course, the GDPR and the pay transparency are equal legislation, but if it would come to it in the end, I think GDPR would be seen as being of higher priority for the EU Court of Justice.
Wow, that was a lot of technical stuff. To me, the most important was to see the clarity of how GDPR rules overrule the pay transparency rules. I think that was a very clear message, and really appreciate these kinds of direct talk. One could easily see a new directive from the EU to be a big burden, and many frankly do so. So how can companies turn this into an opportunity?
Well, I think that companies can turn this into an opportunity by showing job applicants that they very much care about equality and equal pay. I think at least the newer generation wants to be in a company that takes care of the environment and the local community that they're part of, who values diversity and equal pay. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to really go in the front of this as a company and show how it can be done and lead in the sector.
How will the EU handle differences in local legislations, local implementation, and thereby potentially different fines for non-compliance? How is it made sure that it's not going to be unequal business opportunities?
That's a very good question and a valid point. So what we've seen prior to this directive is that we have some member states who already has pay transparency legislation and who does also have different enforcement mechanism. So what this directive also tries to do is to harmonize before we will have 27 different legislations. So it goes in the direction of more harmonization, but then of course you still have the national implementation. And there's also the opportunity for the social partners to make the implementation when it comes to enforcement and fines for especially the Nordic countries. This is relevant. So in the end, it would be up to the European Court of Justice to assess this, but national or enforcement lies with the national competences, at least in this case. We see in other aspects, for example, anti-money laundering, that there you have a strict regulation saying what should the fines be. But unfortunately, on the equality aspects, we don't have that yet.
With all the potential local adjustments, is there any way for companies to seek some sort of central advice? Is there going to be like a central knowledge hub or similar in order to reduce the administrative burden that the companies may face?
Yes, so the Commission is right now preparing the implementation, drawing up guidelines for the member states, but also for businesses. So there will be an element of the Commission helping with the implementation, and then also the member states, together with the equality bodies, should make guidelines for the methodology when it comes to equal value. And then after, if I remember correctly, it's 5 or 8 years, the Commission will review how has it then gone, both when it comes to the administrative costs, but also, of course, the gender pay gap, and then potentially review the legislation.
With the already existing reporting requirements, could you elaborate a little bit on the link between the Pay Transparency Directive and the ESG/CSRD requirements, and just to see how this is connected?
Well, CSRD, in a way, I would say, is the directive that harmonizes the current reporting legislation that we have, and we've had a lot in the EU. So it's an attempt to simplify, but of course also streamline and level up the reporting for companies. So I'm not sure about the exact link, but we see that CSRD touches both on pay transparency, but also, for example, work-life balance. So in a way, I hope that we can find a way to make sure that you don't do the same reporting twice.
So we have this issue around reporting on median, but asking questions on the average. So in the part around the employees' right to information, currently it's formulated as being asked about getting the average salaries and the information on that. We see that creating a lot of issues, and we discussed this before. Is there any way for the countries to kind of translate this to be about the median instead of the average?
I'm not sure if you can deviate from it in a national implementation. Of course, countries can do that, and then the European Court of Justice can decide whether they've done it correctly in the end, or the Commission. But what I can see when I track back the legislation is that the Commission proposed it with average when it comes to the definition, but also the right of information for the individual worker. But when it comes to the reporting, it's the median. So I understand the confusion. And we're trying to see how, from the legislative side now, we can also help to clarify that. And I'm pretty sure the Commission and the National Implementation Boards is also aware.
With most companies, if not all companies, we see a pretty big spread in different pay and different position. And this is very much impacted by high outliers. Some individual with some hot jobs and certain skills, but also some with historical salaries, where they used to have a higher job, now it's slightly smaller. Do you see this as an objective criteria?
Well, it can be dealt with in different ways. Like, you could lower that group of people if you think it would help the pay gap. But I think it's important also to clarify that the aim of this is not that we should all have the same pay, but that we should be sure that if we're differentiated, it's not on the basis of gender. So you can have a person, for example, a man who's had a big role and a lot of pay increases, turn 60 and then maybe go down to a less broad role. And he could still keep his pay as long as we know that it's not because he's a man he's keeping his pay, but because of the experience he has or what he contributes to the company. So companies need to be able to show and prove that the differentiation between the male and female employees doing the same is not based on gender, but based on something else.
What we also see as a concern with the companies we're talking about is that when we're talking about these historical salaries or individuals that used to have a higher job, typically an executive job, and have been sort of demoted but kept their salaries, the issue we see is that this group in itself is virtually only male. Does that impose further issues, or do you see this as an objective criteria still?
I think it would be up for the lawyers to judge, either in a national or European context. But I would say that it's not an issue in itself that it's only male employees that have that pattern. As long as you can show that they don't keep their salary because they're men. That is the baseline. But of course, we need to also see how the case law plays out.
So what is the role of social partners in this?
Well, the social partners play a crucial role in this directive. First of all, they can handle the implementation entirely by themselves if they wish so. And from the legislative side, that's also what we're hoping that they will do in many countries. And then within the single company, workers' representatives play a quite crucial role, both in getting information on behalf of the workers, but also in supporting and also questioning the leadership when it comes to the pay reporting methodologies and the assessment. So this is also a chance to strengthen the social dialogue on the individual workplace, which we very much need in Europe and which we see also helps closing the gender pay gap.
So these were some of the practical implications. And the key takeaway from me here is that we really do need a central knowledge hub. Just imagine needing to find information in every single country within the EU from that local source. That staffing that's needed there, it's too much. So we really need this knowledge hub. Please make sure it happens fast, Kira. So thank you so much for watching. See you again next time for more on rewards. Thank you.